Please join me in welcoming to the stage for this conversation Anna Deveare Smith, professor, playwright, MacArthur Genius Award winner, and as you can see, just a fantastic actor who focuses on community, diversity, and character. Father Greg Boyle, founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. And Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, pediatrician and founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness, a real leader in addressing adversity and toxic stress in children. All right, we've got a big conversation to have. So yes, let's hear it for them. But Anna, I want to pick up on something that you talk about in your show, which is this box of captivity. What is the box of captivity?
The box of captivity?
The box of captivity.
I'm not sure who says that in my show. But I would say that the captivity of poverty is what I know so far, and that there are many aspects to that. And I'm very interested in the ways in which education could be a way of opening that door and setting people free. I think it's unfair, however, that we call the phenomenon of children who can't make it through school and end up in prison the school-to-prison pipeline, because it suggests that teachers, many of whom work very hard, are the cause of the problem in schools. But it seems to me to open that box of captivity, captive to a variety of pathologies and despair and poverty, one needs to reinvent schools and rethink what they are and give teachers and schools the things they need to bring joy and possibility into people's lives.
Dr. Boyle? When you hear adversity as it affects barriers to the dream, what do you think of?
Well, I was born and raised in the gang capital of the world, Los Angeles, but that's quite different from the community where I lived for the last 30 years, where kids have a hard time imagining their future. And if you can't imagine your future, sometimes your present isn't very compelling, and if it doesn't compel you, a great many of the kids in the community where I live and work, they don't care whether they live or die, and they can't conjure up an image of what tomorrow might look like. And so they don't care whether they inflict harm, and they don't care whether they duck to get out of harm's way. And so life is just simply more difficult in that community. So once you have a high degree of reverence for its complexity and the degree of difficulty there is for kids in a community like mine to navigate, then you're called to something different, which is all hands on deck, and people need to show up and pay attention and be loving, caring adults who matter to these kids.
Dr. Burke Harris, I think people are sitting here saying, what is a doctor doing studying adversity?
Yeah, well, I came across the impact of adversity on the development of the brains and bodies of children when I opened a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point. And I was seeing patient after patient after patient who was being referred to me for ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But I was also seeing another funny thing. I was seeing parents who would come in and say, doctora, I noticed that my daughter's asthma seems to get worse when her dad punches a hole in the wall. And when I looked into the research about how early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children, what I found absolutely blew my mind. I did not understand how this was something that I never learned about in medical school and residency.
Tell me more about that. I mean, is adversity then something that can be altered? Is that altered by institutions, by individuals? I mean, if you're in a family situation that's providing toxic stress, what then?
Yeah, so it's all of the above. So what the research shows, they looked at 17,500 adults, and they didn't look at kids, folks who came from Bayview Hunters Point. They were looking in Kaiser, San Diego, 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. And they found that for individuals who experienced one of 10 categories of what they called adverse childhood experiences, and that includes physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was incarcerated, substance dependent, mentally ill, where there was parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence, right? That these folks were 4.5 times as likely to be depressed, that they were twice as likely to develop heart disease, almost 4 times as likely to develop chronic lung disease, 12 times as likely to attempt suicide. And what we figured out from that study is that when you're exposed to high doses of adversity in childhood, it activates our stress response, which changes the structure and function of children's developing brains, their immune systems, and their hormonal systems. But you know what's the antidote to that? Is safe, stable, and nurturing environments. Nurturant caregiving, right? The ability to have adults in your life who are sufficiently well regulated themselves that they can buffer a child's biological stress response is the answer to prevent toxic stress.
And it doesn't need to be parents.
It can be any safe, stable, and nurturing adult.
Father Boyle, I'm curious, in your experience, what is the difference between a kid who survives and thrives and a kid who doesn't make it out?
Well, I think the brain science will talk as well about this chronic, enormous stress, and there's a kind of a survivor brain activity, you know, especially for the young people that I work with, that if you can provide a sanctuary for them, then after a time in a community of tenderness where you're lavishing on them a sense of care and a sense that they're important and that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. Pretty soon they inhabit that truth, they become that truth. And then they become the sanctuary that they sought at our place. And then they go home, and then they provide that sanctuary to their kids. And then this historical and generational trauma starts to get broken in a way that's substantial. But our diagnosis is really important. You know, if we think kids are just making bad choices out there, that's a bad diagnosis. That'll lead us to a treatment plan that's not very good. But if we know that, like I work with gang members, and that no kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang, he's always fleeing something. So address the thing that he's fleeing. Become, you know, the delivery system of hope to infuse it to a kid for whom hope is foreign. And to somehow maybe deliver mental health services in a culturally appropriate and tender way. Maybe you help lead to a place of healing. Because if kids aren't able to transform their pain, they're going to continue to transmit it. And it all happens in an environment. If it's not at home, then it can happen in a place that we create, a community of tenderness where people matter.
And I want to ask you the same question I asked Father Boyle, since you are this observer of the human condition. In your experience, what separates a kid who survives and thrives from a kid who doesn't make it?
Well, I think that what Father Boyle has said is correct. I have to say that after 250 interviews around the United States in 4 geographic areas, Northern California, Baltimore, is my hometown, Philly, and South Carolina, I actually didn't hear the word L-O-V-E very much. The place I did hear it was in Finland, where I went to, because apparently Finland, at least at one point, had the best schools, and I heard it from the person who was would be comparable to our Secretary of Education. And so, you know, it's a almost corny thing to say, but it's really what both of you are talking about, is love, meaning care and tenderness. But the other thing that interests me, and I think Dr. Burke Harris, you might have something to say about this. I'm doing a little bit of work at the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford right now, and they're very concerned about the children who are well off, who are the rash of suicides there. And I wonder, and don't know the answer, if there's any relationship to children who are committing suicide in affluent environments to children who are killing one another in environments of economic distress. So there does seem to me to be something about our youth that we should also think about in a large picture.
Well, you mentioned Stanford. I grew up in Palo Alto, and we know Pali High is one of the suicide risk areas. And what you see is the biology is the same. right? The biology of chronic adversity. And what the data shows us is that adverse childhood experiences occur in absolutely every community, right? The difference is, oftentimes in affluent community, that nurturant caregiver is absent, maybe because they're too busy getting caught up in their own stuff, or they're traveling all the time, they're in their careers, or you have parents who are not there and present with their kids. In low-income communities, what we see is parents who are often also away, either working several jobs or whatever, but more often parents who are experiencing the crushing stress of poverty themselves, that they are unable to be a buffer to their child's stress because they are so overwhelmed with their own stress. But the fundamental biological mechanism is the same, and that is why finding solutions, which include, number one, routine screening. Every pediatrician in America should be screening for adverse childhood experiences. And I don't care if you are in Palo Alto or Bayview Hunters Point or Manhattan or wherever. Every pediatrician in America should be screening for adverse childhood experiences. We need to be doing early detection and effective intervention, and we know that there are many, many effective interventions to stabilize the stress response and help children's brains and bodies grow in a healthy way.
Yeah, I want to come back to something that you said earlier, which was this idea that a child needs an individual, an adult, and doesn't necessarily have to be a parent who can serve as a buffer. How do you bring that idea to scale? If someone's not lucky enough to be at your youth center to meet Father Boyle, how do you take that idea and manifest it nationally?
So, believe it or not, I feel like it's not that hard to take it to scale. A couple things. Number one, on the early detection front, I'm working with the American Academy of Pediatrics because every kid's got a pediatrician, right? So, and they're getting their regular well child checks, including that ACE screening as part of the regular well child check, I think is critically important. And then connecting children to services. There are child-serving institutions and services in every community, and they need to be armed with this information to understand that the cure, if you will, for toxic stress is, number one, to reduce the dose of adversity for the child. So if it's not Father Boyle, it can be the Y, it can be the Boys and Girls Club, it can be a theater troupe, it could be dance and song, it could be whatever you're doing. Right?
And also, if we would bring these things back into schools,
Yeah. And
arts,
yes.
and sports, if for no other reason, to give children an opportunity to succeed, to have more opportunities to succeed inside of that structure of a school, and more mentorship in a variety of areas, not just academic areas.
But one of the obstacles, I think, is that people disqualify themselves. They presume that they can't be a loving, caring adult to certain kids. That they say, well, that's, we don't share the same experience or race or background. And I think if you're the proud owner of a Pulse, you can be kind of the loving, caring adult who pays attention. And so we already know what to do, I think. And as General Powell was saying, all we need to do is summon the will. And the will really is to stand against forgetting that we belong to each other, that somehow the fact that we are separate is really an illusion. There is no us and them, it's just us. And so in the end, if we work to create somehow a community of kinship where we're connected to each other, where we belong to each other, and no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality, and that there isn't a single person that I've ever met or known or imagined who couldn't be a beneficial presence to a kid who has suffered, in that way in terms of adverse experiences.
I'm going to jump in because I 1,000% agree with that and say amen. And I am a big believer in really thoughtful strategies to help us have a clear roadmap to get where we want to go faster. So I also believe that every teacher in America, as part of regular teacher training, should be able to recognize the symptoms of toxic stress. I'm sick and tired of hearing about children as early as preschool being booted out of school for expressing symptoms of a neurodevelopmental challenge, right? It's unjust. And it shouldn't be happening. And exactly what Anna said in terms of this is not about blaming teachers. If you had a teacher trying to teach a class of 30 kids and 15 of them had epilepsy, you're not going to blame the teacher when the test scores come in low. You need to understand that toxic stress is about inhibition of the executive function in the prefrontal cortex. That's biologically what happens. And so when we have organizations like, Turnaround for Children right here in New York, that builds infrastructure and protocols within the teaching and learning environment to help to reduce the impact of adversity, then what we see is that kids are able to learn and thrive.
I want to pick up on a word that Father Boyle put out there, which is this word belonging. And I think that there are many places where we struggle with this idea of belongingness. I say I teach the fancy people. I teach at NYU, I taught at Stanford and so forth. And even though those people have advantages, there's always this knocking on the door of I don't belong here. And I think if there are ways that we could share what we know, or even suggest to the general public that these matters of lack of love, lack of care, stress, the lack of the feeling of belonging, if there was a way that we could see this as an overall national project, it would help us, Father Boyle, come closer to this us that we really are in the end.
I'm curious, Anna, 250 interviews all over the country. You walk away with a clear sense of the despair that is out there, the complexity of these issues. Where is the hope?
Oh, well, first of all, I think of hope the way Cornel West does. It's not the same as optimism. He says optimism looks outside and says, looks pretty good, things are going to be better. But hope looks out and says, doesn't look good at all. It doesn't look good at all. The evidence looks really bad, but I'm going to go beyond the evidence I'm going to make a leap of faith. I'm going to go beyond the evidence to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious to allow people to engage in heroic actions. So if that's what hope is, then what I see is extraordinarily imaginative people, from somebody like Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, a neuroendocrinologist who's looking at this through science, through the wonderful social scientists I've met, to the chief judge of the Yurok tribe, who's trying to bring her forgotten youth back to their culture, back to the dances, seeing that there may be some healing there. So all over this country, I have found people with extraordinary ideas and a big heart and a big mind, and I just think we need to have a great big conference with all of them.
Father Boyle, we only have a few seconds left, but I want to come back to this question of doing for people who are in this audience who want to know what they can do. What is the doing?
Yeah, proximity is really key here. So if you can go to the margins, and you don't go out to the margins to rescue anybody, but go figure, if you end up at the margins, everybody gets rescued. I don't believe I've ever saved the life of a gang member, but I know that somehow my own salvation is connected to folks who are trustworthy guides, who know how to lead me to kinship. And I think if we all just move beyond ourselves and where we are to the margins where folks have to deal with adversity, it would certainly help.
So for Father Boyle, this is a spiritual and moral opportunity. I think we can also help through the arts rebuild the moral imagination of the country, try to bring people back to goodness.
That's right.
All right. Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking us.